Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you feel the same when it's over. Just nice to be welcomed and into this beautiful auditorium on such an enormous theme. And I'm just fascinated by how the technology puts together everything so quickly, so we immediately know what everybody is thinking and almost hearing people change their minds. Now that's as incredible as it gets. The evening will be as follows. I will present my talk for about 45 minutes. Interestingly enough, let me give you at least a one-line description because it'll add to the theme of today. My ancestors came from the highest caste of the Hindu priesthood in the Deep South. I myself became a follower of Jesus in my teens. I mention all of that to say because at the end of my talk, I'll be joined for a Q&A session by Dr. Nabil Qureshi, whose parents actually hail from Pakistan. And he was formerly a Muslim and now a follower of Christ himself. And I find it incredible when I think of this because I was born and raised in India. And if there's any point of tension in India today, it is the whole issue of the Indo-Pak conflict. All that goes on and rages. I've just returned from India a few days ago. And here we are, two of us, talking on the issue of tolerance in an American university campus. Two brown faces coming up onto the platform to speak to an audience like this. Only in America could we have such a privilege accorded, and hopefully what follows from a discussion can also be of great meaning. It reminds me of the gentleman who walked into a room, and he was from Japan, walked into this dining room, and there was a table at the front, and he sat down, and the Englishman looking at him thought maybe he would help him a bit. So when the Japanese gentleman sat down and was opening a book of his, the English gentleman looked at him and picked up the spoon and said, "This be spoony." And then he took the knife and said, "And this be knifey. And this be forky. And this be platey." And the Japanese gentleman kept nodding. At the end of the lunch, to the shock of the Englishman, the Japanese gentleman was the keynote speaker. And he delivered the talk in flawless English, sat down and looked at the Englishman and said, "You likey speechy?" I feel a little bit like that today, although I'm not sure you likey the speechy. But it's just wonderful to have a privilege of being in such a distinguished institution. Thank you to all of the groups that have made it possible for me to be here, for your kindness, your warm invitation. And when Nabil joins me, you'll truly be inspired to hear from a man like him, a medical doctor by training, but picked up other degrees along the way. He is part of my team now, and I think on a theme of tolerance, I thought it'd be just exciting to have some of his perspectives as well. I was raised in India in a minority, both living in the north, coming from the south, and by virtue of my faith. India is, of course, 80% Hindu, 10% Muslim. Christian population at that time was less than 2%, more like 4% now. So growing up in those settings, you get accustomed to believing in a counter perspective, or learning to live in a pluralistic society is a constant challenge. I returned from India last week, and amazingly, to find audiences packed in every case, whether it is a business community or the acting world of Bollywood, or whether it was the medical school in the south in Vellore, every setting to have a packed audience, asking questions about faith, about purpose, about meaning, and what it really means to be human. Once upon a time, I'd be standing in front of Indian audiences like that, terrified, because I knew my worldview would be quite dramatically different to that of the audience in front of me. And now when you stand up and speak of those, notably a few times I've done it with the Bollywood world, how they will lean forward, listen, interact, ask some of the brightest questions. And it is a marvelous example of what it is to be able to discuss issues of such incredible importance, some of which could actually go deep into the consciences, laying claim to that conscience, but to do it in a civil way, without rancor, without hate, and without that sense of bitterness that oftentimes disagreements can spawn. So I hope whatever happens tonight, that one thing that we can see accomplished is at the end of it, around your tables or your homes or in your classroom, that these issues can be discussed without that hostility. Because let's ask ourselves one fundamental question. What is the ultimate goal in a civilized society? Is it really that we will all agree with each other? I doubt it. That is really to pursue the impossible. But what is possible is that even in the midst of our disagreement, we will learn to live in a civil way, as deep as those differences might be. I have learned to live that way. I've learned to be in audiences like that. Many times I'm in Islamic universities. I know how tense those audiences will be. I remember a few years ago being in the oldest Islamic University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, and in front of that audience with mullahs and scholars sitting in the front row, having to speak for 1 hour in the defense of my faith. And I tell you the truth, at the end of it, when I walked in, the professor of world religions there was Professor Baharuddin, specializing in Islamics, and her actual words to me were, if it were not improper, I would lean over and give you an embrace and give you a hug for the way the subject matter was handled today. And I said, Professor Baharuddin, that's the best compliment you can give to me. So whether it's in a Buddhist framework or a Hindu framework or an Islamic framework or a secular framework, this is my calling. And if there is any way in which I have offended you without warrant or without meaning to come across in the way I did, please do not hesitate to let me know, because that is not my intent. My intent is to get us thinking seriously and in a sober-minded way, because America is at the crossroads. The North America into which I came in my 20s is very different to the North America of today. And one has to be incredibly cautious, as one word can create such turmoil and go viral within minutes and create havoc for everybody. That does not really benefit the subject matter at all. So please, as we present it, we want to do it with sensitivity, and if there are points of deep tension, what I would want more than anything else is for you to let us know, so that we know at least that we are standing on a clear ground of communication. In the 1980s, there was an article written in Atlantic Monthly in which America was being discussed as a country on a dramatically different course to how far it had come in prior years. So 1980s was the year the sociologists were beginning to really delineate all the changes that were taking place. And the article written by Daniel Yankelevich began with a definition of culture, and this is how he worded it. Culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. So when you take that statement alone, you see that it is setting before us the course of coherence as the goal to answer the existential questions, meaning the felt questions of the heart and the mind as they are bridged, to find a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives. That is the goal of what culture is intended to be, as Yankelevich and Bell and other social theorists were commenting. But then they went on to say this: we are in the midst of a cultural revolution in America. And they were looking at the previous 2 decades, from the 60s into the 80s. And here's what they said: a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. A cultural revolution is underway when you make a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past, particularly on the issues of the purpose and meaning of life. And they said that decisive break had taken place from the shared meanings of the past. A cultural revolution was in full sway. As they began to discuss the various issues that were causing this dissonance and the discord in a fascinating end to the article, here's what he does. He goes and surveys individuals and couples to come to the conclusion as to what it is they now really felt on the heels of this revolution that had begun 2 decades earlier. And here's one couple by the name of Abby and Mark, and this is the way Yankelevich summarized it. If you feel it is imperative to fill all of your needs, and if these needs are contradictory or in conflict with those of others, or simply unfillable, then frustration inevitably follows. To Abby and to Mark as well, self-fulfillment means having a career and marriage and children and sexual freedom and autonomy and being liberal and having money and choosing nonconformity and insisting on social justice and enjoying city life and country living and simplicity and graciousness and reading and good friends and on and on. But the individual is not truly fulfilled by becoming ever more autonomous. Indeed, to move too far in this direction is to risk psychosis, the ultimate form of autonomy. And then he ends with these incredible words, the injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. The injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. Now, if the social theorists, in studying all the cultural shifts that were underway, come to this conclusion that in the end you cannot really pursue contradictorily fulfilling passions, you will end up with a collapse from within if you attempt to do that. And he says what really matters then at that point is that the breakdown within reveals to you that if you want to find yourself, you have to give up some things. You have to lose yourself. And it is a truth that's very hard for us in North America to come to terms with. Now, what's true of Mark and Abby is true of a family. What's true of a family is true of a community. What's true of a community is true of a culture. The statement is positively clear that in order to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. Now, here it is. He's laying down a truth in the pursuit of self-fulfillment. And I think it is critical we understand that if this great nation is to survive with the nobility and the dignity of the intent with which it started, then sacrifices will have to be made from everybody in all ways of thinking, and to come to the terms that we simply cannot have it in every way, in all of our longings and all of our fulfillments. It will never be so, for they are contradictory in pursuit. Now, I want to help you travel with me for the last 30 to 40 years when this change came, and describe 3 moods that took over. The first 2 are very critical entry points for culture. Nothing wrong with the entry point. It is the exit point that has created dangers, which is where, therefore, we need to take a step back to redefine what we actually mean by the entry point. There are 3 moods that began to take over. Writers were dealing with it, and the secular city was being penned, and all the descriptions of a secularized worldview were becoming front and center. And so the first mood that took over very radically in articulation was the mood called secularization. What do I mean by that? Secularization is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations are losing their social significance. It's a process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations are losing their social significance. Very readily, if you take any volatile issue of our time that's socially really divisive, and you put a panel in front of you, and you've got a psychologist or a highly educated philosopher or a social theorist, a medical doctor, a university president, a lawyer, and put a minister in the midst of that, and the discussion is underway. To an average person sitting in the audience, the skeptic will say the minister is the most prejudiced of the whole group by virtue of being in ministry. The assumption will be made that everyone else is quite objective, has done his or her philosophical or theoretical homework, and there's no degree of subjectivity there. Only the religiously minded person is being subjective. I have a colleague of mine sitting in the audience right now. She went to a very prestigious university here in the United States. And in one of her lectures, the professor was constantly on an assault of the Christian faith. Now, I find that very fascinating. I know that same professor would never do it with Hinduism, or with Buddhism, or with Islam, certainly not with Islam, because he probably may not be making too many more speeches on the subject. It's true, because they will not take the offense of attempting to blaspheme that which they consider sacred. Richard Dawkins, if he really had the courage about all his anti-theistic thinking, ought to stand up in audiences where he sees the kind of hostility that he vents with his worldview and find out that all not worldviews are created equal. But this young student was sitting in the class and raised her hand, and she says to the professor, "I don't appreciate it. You are constantly attacking that which is sacred to me." And what does she get in return? She's sent to the dean's office. So she goes over to the dean's office, and she says, "I don't know why I'm here." He says, "Because you're being disruptive in the classroom." She said, "I'm not being disruptive in the classroom. I'm just taking issue with the fact that in a totally unrelated discipline and subject, he constantly finds a reason to attack that which is my faith. I just don't see the connection." And he says to her, "You are here for an education." She says, "I'm not getting an education in this. I'm being indoctrinated." He said, "No, ma'am, you've got this all wrong. For 18 years in your home and your family, you have been indoctrinated. We are now going to educate you." Whoa. I dare the same professor to try the track and stack in some other settings. You see, nothing is accomplished by that. But what has really happened in the mix of secularization is that we've got this whole mindset where if you have a religious worldview, you are automatically living by, quote, faith. And if you've got a naturalistic framework, you are automatically living by reason. It is interesting that the framers of the documents of this country signed the documents with this statement: "We put our names with our sacred honor." With our sacred honor. That's not a scientific statement. That's a statement that your honor and your integrity are at stake when you're putting your name to a document and all the ideas with which you wish to shape this country. I find it absolutely staggering. I've been invited repeatedly to China and back again to lecture, and the education system in China is asking people like myself to come and talk on ethics, and they will openly tell you that they know the impact of the Judeo-Christian worldview within American culture that has kept that culture somehow cohesive and strong and ethically finding its norms, and that's really all they want from here, how to build that ethical cohesiveness within a Marxist framework. Fascinating that they see the need of an ethical cohesiveness for it all. But as I look and watch the changes taking place, where does this get us off? What is the exit point? And writers are incredibly insightful and incisive in the way they are actually portraying what has happened. I've always believed that the Scottish philosophical activist Andrew Fletcher in the 1800s made the comment, thus he said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. It's the poets and the lyricists who will get to the heart of the issue much more quickly than the theorists would." And here's what one writer in England, Steve Turner, tongue-in-cheek, has to say about the West. He said, what do we believe? What is our creed? We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay, as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that only taboos are taboo. We believe that everything is getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are really the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust. History will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth, excepting for the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he adds this postscript. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear a state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blasts school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. If chance is the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. Where do we get off with this? Where do we exit when we make secularization with an uppercase S to evict all religious thought and all religious belief in the public square, which is really what often happens? Where do we get off? I'll tell you what happens. The definitions to which we cling will become extremely elusive till we do not know where to draw the lines of difference anymore. I give the illustration in the 1980s of Larry Flynt being brought to trial in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's been my home for 25 years now. And Larry Flynt's pornography was considered so bad that even those who were discussing it would say it made Playboy magazine look very normal and very acceptable. The perversions and all that were going on in his magazine, so he was taken to court. But the lawyer defending him had a very clever ploy. The clever ploy was basically something like this: asking a potential juror if they had, first if they had gone to church, and if they had ever gone to church, then they didn't qualify to be in the jury because they'd be prejudiced. But once they got selected, he would quiz them thus: have you ever gone into an art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery to see the paintings of the great masters of art? Yes. Have you paid to do that and go in and see those paintings sometimes of disrobed people? Yes. Would you explain now to this, he would ask the witness, would you explain to this jury why you paid to do that and you called it art and you call my client's stuff pornography? So bring the witness up, ask him all these questions. You paid to go into an art gallery where you saw paintings of disrobed people and you called it art. Explain to this jury why you call that art and why you call my client's stuff pornography. And of course, you don't get into a philosophical debate at that point. But I thought to myself, you know, it's a good question. It's a loaded question. I can't minimize it. But if I sat across that lawyer in a conversation, a cup of coffee in hand, and he asked me the same question, I'd ask him, have you read the biography of Michelangelo? Michelangelo was beginning to do that, and his lawyer teacher wanted to just caution him. for his motive and being circumspect. And he looked at my young Michelangelo and he said to him, "Why are you doing this?" Michelangelo said, "Because I want to see man as God sees man." And he said, "That's right. Just remember, you're not God." Tuck that at the back of your mind and move to this. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Pilgrim's Regress, talking about his own conversion. He calls it a pilgrim's regress rather than progress because he was confronted with pantheism, with naturalism, all of that along the way. And he kept rejecting them one by one, this great mind, this great scholar. But he didn't know why. He said until he came to have that relationship with Christ, and he took a regressive journey because he had the answers. In this book, allegorically, talks of the time he was in humanism by the spirit of the age, in the mountain called the Spirit of the Age. And he pictures himself bound in shackles in the spirit of the age. Fascinating picture that here he is in the humanistic framework, picturing himself enslaved, almost like what somebody today would describe like a Boris Becker in his recently released book, Life is Not a Game. You enshackle yourself by some of your habits. And so it was with Lewis, referring to himself as John. And at one point, the waiter brings him a tray with his breakfast, unshackles him to give him his breakfast. And he enjoys the milk and comments on the tastiness and the nourishing flavor of this milk. And the waiter smiles at him and he says, "You only call it nourishing, you only call it tasty. It's the secretion of a cow, isn't it? It secretes urine, it secretes milk. That's all it is. It's the secretion of a cow that you're enjoying." He nearly gags over that. And then he said, "I made the mistake of commenting on the eggs till the waiter reminded me what they were." And he said, "I don't know what to do. The tray is taken from me. I'm in shackles again." He said, "All of a sudden, reason comes riding on a horse and rescues me and says to the man in the spirit of the age, 'You lie because you don't know the difference between what nature is meant for nourishment and what nature is meant for garbage. You don't know the difference between what nature is meant for nourishment and what nature is meant for refuse.'" You see, for the man or the woman in front of the lens of the camera, whose body is being used purely to titillate the fanciful imagination of somebody who's buying into it, whose mind will be so assaulted in a way that no human being in this world would have the capacity of ever satisfying. Where it's a feeling that is pursued, where it's an imagination that has been assaulted. The person sitting in front of the lens of that camera ought to say, "Don't do this to me. Don't do this to me." But the person won't, because when secularization has done its full work, it'll produce a generation devoid of shame. That's the question we need to ask at the exit point of our culture. Are there issues in our lives that ought to bring shame, that ought to bring guilt, that ought to bring some sense of remorse? My daughter, Naomi, works with rescuing women from the sex trafficking industry. And she's just a wee little thing, and I'm terrified sometimes when I see her going on these trips. She'll go into Amsterdam, into the red light district. They know her there now. She'll go in and ask for just a few minutes. They'll turn that red light off. They're just being carted back and forth from countries by men who own them, using them till they're in their mid-20s or late 20s, and they're done and finished and gone with. In Thailand, they're brought in from the time in their early teens. By 21 or 22, a high percentage of them with AIDS just discarded. If a person doesn't know the difference between art and pornography, or the peddling of the human body for the sake of some momentary thrill, then secularization has done its deadly work, and it's reminded you and me at that point that if no transcendent moral ethic is brought to bear upon the nature of what we are essentially meant to be, then there's nothing to stop this slide down and down and down and down. Reminding me of the words of Hitler in Auschwitz, "I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel." You know, I spoke at Angola prison some months ago, It is a prison where 85% of them are on life without parole, 45 on death row. When you went into prison there years ago, it was the bloodiest prison in the country. You would see blood marks, they tell me, on the walls, on the carpets, on the ceiling, and when you were checked in as a prisoner, you were given a knife to defend yourself. I'll tell you what happened and change, but that's not germane to what I want to say to you right now, except this. When I walked into the room where they are executed, I'll tell you what, every bone within your body is reacting, every fiber is reacting within you, wondering, could you ever be the one to turn that switch on? And the chaplain was telling me he doesn't go to those rooms anymore. He can't stand the thought of it because he watches the prisoner lying there and the phone, is it going to ring in the last minute for a reprieve of some sort and a stay? He said, the last one I saw, a man was on death row for having raped and murdered his own daughter. And the wife was sitting behind glass watching the execution about to take place. He said, I just about broke down completely when he turned his head towards his wife in that last second and just said, I'm sorry. You know, there's a sliver of a ray of hope there. Just a sliver of a ray of hope. And the man just turned and said, it's okay, like Eichmann did. Not a problem. Walks to the gallows saying, it's all okay. I don't believe in any of this afterlife stuff. Think carefully. Where do we want to get off with secularization if there is no transcendent worldview that is going to be allowed in the public square? If nothing of that is going to be tolerated by virtue of the fact that it believes in a thought that is branded religious. Second is pluralization. Pluralization is where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. Now, I want you to know, I think pluralization is the best way in which society ought to function. I am a privileged visitor to North America. When I was 20 years old, I'd never left home. I was a home guy. My older brother was 22, I was 20, and my father bought us both tickets to go to Toronto, Canada. He said, go and find a job there, find a living there. He told me to go and find a university education and somehow earn on part-time. He just left us on our own. We had $400 in our pocket. That's it. The government of India wouldn't allow you any more foreign exchange than that. So the first few days, we were literally living on one hot dog and Coke a day till we'd find a job somewhere. And I come into this world all of a sudden and I think to myself, you know what a great privilege Canada has given me. I'm here as a guest. They don't owe me this. And at that time in Canada, there were 500 Indians in the city of Toronto in mid-1960s. I was one of the 500. Today, when you go to Toronto, there's 500,000 in Toronto alone. When I first came there, if you saw an Indian across the street, you'd cross and talk and go and have a kahani, chai pe okay, let's go and have a cup of tea. If I did that in Toronto today, I'll never get anywhere. Completely changed, completely changed. Pluralization, as somebody described Los Angeles, where on the side of the road there's a cart where a Korean is selling kosher tacos. That's pluralization of cuisine. And I think pluralization of cuisine is absolutely delightful because when I arrived in Toronto, they had only one Indian restaurant, and it was an apology for Indian cuisine. When I went there, I said, I would never like this stuff too, and I told them, you really should change this to imaginary cuisine. It's not Indian cuisine. Today, some of the best Indian restaurants in the world are in Toronto. People ask me, why do Indians die so young? I say, because God's getting them up there quicker to prepare the marriage supper of the Lamb. When we get there, the food is going to be Indian, you know. Indian cuisine, one Englishman described it to me as a hunk and a sip and a chunk and a blow. The hot pepper just gets to you, but my, what a foretaste of all the glories that could lie ahead. Plurality of cuisine is fascinating. You know, when I was 26, I married Margie. She's from Canada. There were 2 other Indian guys who also married Canadian girls, and we used to meet once a month or whenever we could, and we called it the Zebra Fellowship. We're from India, our wives are from Canada. It was so rare to see that happening. So much has changed, and wonderfully for the better. Take a look at the faculties around the world today and see the number of Indian doctors and Indian engineers. It's a great thing to experience this. Pluralization is a marvelous thing in society, and the world salutes America and Canada and parts of Europe for opening the doors to get the privilege given to people from other parts of the world to come and enjoy the goodness of the land. So I thank you. But here's what I want to say. If pluralization is ever extrapolated into meaning moral relativism, then the exit point is deadly again. If secularization leads you to no point of reference for shame, nothing can be branded as shameful, then pluralization lives with the danger that ultimately there is no absolute, there is no reason, there is no rationality, there are no boundaries, there are no absolutes. Once again, the musicians point this out to us. King Crimson, Cat's Foot, Iron Claw, neurosurgeons scream for more, from Paranoia's Poison Door, 21st century schizoid man. Blood rack, barbed wire, politicians, funeral pyre, innocents raped with napalm fire, 21st century schizoid man. The walls on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death, the sunlight brightly gleams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath as silence drowns the screams? Between the iron gates of fate, the seeds of time are sown and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. G.K. Chesterton says the same thing in a more poignant and more powerful passage. And when I read that to you, you'll find few have articulated it with such brilliance. Here's what he says. Listen carefully. Speaking to the rebel who wants to rebel against all moral absolutes. Listen to what he says. The new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty. Therefore, he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, then as a philosopher that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls the flag a bauble, then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. Pretty powerful stuff. Pretty powerful language. I'll never forget, I'll give this as my illustration here and then move to my final thought quickly here. I was in California once doing a series of lectures, and a professor came up to me, and he was quite strident and quite loud and quite hostile. And he says to me, I want you to speak one night, it's an American gentleman talking to me, on why you're not a Hindu. I said, I won't speak on that. He said, I dare you to do it. He said, I dare you to do it. because I have become one myself, and I teach that in my class. I'll bring my whole class in philosophy. If you speak on that subject, I will bring all of them, and they'll rip you to shreds afterwards. I thought that's supposed to be an enticing invitation for me to take on the subject. I said, no, I won't bite. I said, but I tell you what I'll do. Bring your whole class. I will speak on why I'm a Christian. If you want to tear me to shreds after that, we can do it. He said, well, I don't like that, but if that's what you want to do, okay. So they came. You could just tell which was the philosophy section in the auditorium that night. So at the end of my defense on talking about the law of non-contradiction and why that mutually exclusive truths cannot both be accepted without some qualification, and why the claims of all of these worldviews, not just Christianity, but Hinduism is exclusive, Buddhism is exclusive, Islam is, they all lay claim to that. I said, so don't just put it in one direction, and it's reasonable that a claim would have to claim exclusivity. The question is whether it can be defended. So when I finished my talk on my defense of the Christian faith, he came up to the front and he began by saying this: you have done the greatest damage to this worldview that I've ever heard any man do in this, and that's because you really don't understand Eastern philosophy. I said, all right, sir. I said, let me stop you right there. I'm not going to get into it with you here, because you're going to try to impress your students. I'm going to try to impress them. We're going to lose truth along the way. I want to get to the truth. I said, let's go out for a meal. You pay, I'll pray, and we'll talk. And so he agreed, He said, can I bring the professor of psychology with me? I was sure at that point because he wanted us to be studied by somebody else. So the three of us went out. And we go out, and this professor of philosophy starts with a talk. His opening line was flawed, but you don't stop anybody that soon. He looked at me and he said, there are only two kinds of logic. It was dead wrong, but I didn't stop him. And then he goes on to explain, there is this either-or kind of logic, the law of non-contradiction, either this or that. It is a Western way of thinking. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, all right, move on. He said, then we move to the both-and kind of logic. It is not either this or that, both this and that. The thesis spawning its antithesis, you come together for a synthesis. What Marx used in his dialectical materialism, he said Eastern philosophy uses it in its pursuit of nirvana and moksha and all of that. So for them it is not either this or that, it is both this and that. It's an Eastern way of thinking. I said, no, it isn't. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. I said, yes, it is. He said, what do you mean, no, it's not? I said, keep going. So he finished. I said, are you finished? He said, yes. I said, so you've told me the either-or, the law of non-contradiction, is a Western way of thinking. The both-and, the dialectical way of thinking, is the Eastern way of thinking. And what you have told me is that the reason I have debunked every other worldview that moves the dialectical way is because I don't understand it. You told me that if I understand the fact that you can accept contradictory statements, I would never do away with these kinds of thinking. I should understand their logic first, and for them both-and applies, not either-or. So you have to take contradiction and accept it. I said, that's what you're saying? He said, yes. He had taken all the placemats and drawn out his argument. The Western way of thinking, either-or, Eastern way of thinking, both-and, and I'm really doing injustice to the Eastern way of thinking because I should be content with contradiction. I said, sir, I just have one question for you. You're telling me when I studied this worldview, I either use the both-and system or nothing else. Is that right? I either use the both-and logic or nothing else. Is that right? He'd only just started to eat. And he put his knife and fork down, and I quote, here's what he says to me: the either-or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? And the professor of psychology said, I think we can go now. I said, I want to tell you something, sir. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. I said, you don't understand either Shankara or Gautama Buddha. If Gautama Buddha believed in the both-and, explain to me why it was he was born a Hindu and walked away from Hinduism and started his own pursuit of enlightenment. Why couldn't he take both hands? Why did Shankara write his dissertation and his thesis on the exclusivity of the Vedic literature and so on? You see, ladies and gentlemen, truth has a jagged edge. It ultimately will stab you if you try to walk against it. Winston Churchill said the most valuable thing in the world is the truth. It is so valuable that often it is hidden by a bodyguard of lies. Andrei Sakharov, Natan Sharansky, the former justice minister in the Soviet Union, went back from Israel to the former place where he had been imprisoned in solitary confinement. He took his wife, and as he went back to the prison, his wife was about to go with him. He said, "Could you stand out for a moment, please? I want to go in alone." He said, "Because I sat there for day after day after day, dark in that dungeon where I really found myself." And Sharansky went there and wept, thinking of how they nearly destroyed him. But as he came out, he asked if he could go to the grave of Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who gave Russia the atomic bomb. And the media followed him, and he went and laid a wreath at Sakharov's grave. And he came back and said, "The reason I have done this is because of what Sakharov said to me." He said, "I always thought the most powerful weapon in the world was the bomb. I have changed my mind. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth." Does America want the truth? With pluralization, which is a good thing, are we going to exit with an absolutizing of relativism? Think about it. And finally, privatization, where what you believe in the most sacred, you're forced to keep to the private and never bring it into the public. That's where America is headed. And with great sadness, I say to you, this is the deadliest of all mistakes we are making. Because that which is sacred to you in private is also sacred to you in public. It ought to be a serious thing. I have learned to live with disagreement. I've learned to give people all the floor time they want in dialoguing and defending and debating. But I've walked away embracing that person and saying, truth will win out in the end. We have the right to disagree, but we don't have the right to be disagreeable. I'll tell you what I've noticed in 41 years of travel, and I'll close with an illustration or two here. It is this. The cancer of our time can be described in one word: meaninglessness. Meaninglessness. You talk to an average young person today, how many sexual trysts do they really want to find fulfillment? How much money in the bank do they really want to find fulfillment? The loneliest people in the world I have found have been the most indulgent ones who've come away totally empty. As Chesterton said, meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Skeptics often tell me that it's the problem of pain that keeps them from believing in God. May I suggest to you, it's the problem of pleasure that keeps me from being totally secular. Been there, done that, tried this. It simply doesn't work. I recall when I was doing a Bible study with the Atlanta Braves when they were playing the St. Louis Cardinals, sort of 10, 12 minutes each of the chapels. And I walked in there, and I closed with this. I said to them, you know, fellas, there's nothing like walking into a room and being the only one who fails the physical. I said, I looked at you boys, muscles bulging like watermelons, and I walk in here. I'll never forget the line of my wife once when I gave her a nice, good hug. She smiled, hugged me back, and said, you know what? You have the arms of a thinking man. I burst out laughing. And she said, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean that in a bad way. I didn't mean that. Oh, what a compliment. What a compliment. I said, I'll do my best to make these the arms of a non-thinking man. So I said, guys, I can't talk to you about baseball. You guys hit a ball long before I know it's even come. So no, I'm not going to talk to you about that. I said, here's what I want to talk to you about. How to live your life on the road, because I've probably lived that longer than any one of you sitting in front of me. They leaned forward and started to listen. one of the most notable players from one of the teams, multi-million-dollar contract, walks up towards me and he puts his hand on the back of my neck like this, and then puts his head on my shoulder and starts to sob. And my travel assistant, knowing it was a very precious moment for him, just walked away into the distance, and he looked at me and he said, "Ravi, I have more money than I ever thought I'd have, but I want to tell you I've lost everything of real value in my life. I wished I'd applied the principles you gave us today long before." Are we on the highway to abandonment with pleasure without principle, pleasure without boundaries? Think about it. Think about it. You can't have everything. You can't. Meaninglessness is the plague of an average university student around the globe today. I could find better ways to make a living than what I'm doing. But this is a calling. This is a conviction. And I will tell you, I have seen lives transformed who've taken that path and turned away from complete hedonistic paths to a life that builds its moral boundaries with the revelation of God Himself. Secularization is a good entry point. No, we do not want a theocratic culture. We do not want a state religion. That would be even worse. But secularization that does not allow religious discourse in the public square on the academy is going to end up with a generation devoid of shame. Pluralization, if it doesn't understand the laws of logic and moral boundaries, will end up ultimately living in systemic and systematic contradiction. It'll weigh down, it'll implode under the weight of its own loose living. And finally, privatization, where you sever the public from the private and you force a person to believe all the sacred things in private and never bring it into the public square, you end up with a totally desacralized society. In the words of Albert Camus, the loneliest moment is when you have just experienced that which you thought will deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. And so I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, if we are going to be civil in the square, if we are going to be respectful of each other's, we have three choices as an application. We can have a theonomous culture, a heteronymous culture, or an autonomous culture. A theonomous culture where we may believe that God's law is so ingrained in our hearts that we all think the same way. There is no culture around like that. India is the closest thing to it, but most cultures will not accept that because it'll come close to making a state religion. We don't want a theonomous culture. We haven't had it in history to see it once we did away with natural law. Heteronymous culture is that which a handful from above dictate to the masses below. Islamic states are heteronymous cultures. Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia are heteronymous cultures. They enforce the belief from the few over the masses. In Marxism, in China, in Russia, they are heteronymous cultures dictating to the masses what they must believe. Theonomous, we don't see it visible. Heteronymous is not where America needs to go. So you've got an autonomous culture, autos meaning self, nomos meaning law, where we pride in our individuality. If that is true, then we must be respectful of each person's belief, and I must be respected for my belief too, in the Word of God, in my commitment to Christ, and let the truth ultimately win out. If we are truly going to be autonomous, let's follow it through. Let's not tell people we have an autonomous culture, and as soon as they say they believe in God, switch to an heteronymous technique and enforce them not to believe in the liberty of their own conscience, but compel them to believe in something else. Theonomous, heteronymous, autonomous. And I believe the last is our option here. And in the marketplace, in the debating square, truth will win out. And if that happens, America has hope for the future. That is my talk for you tonight. God bless you. Thank you.